Hello and welcome to the TBC podcast, where we talk about curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. I'm Keith Wood, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jacob Leporacci, who heads up the Biblical Studies Department here at Trinity Baptist College. Thank you for joining me.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So your background is in worship studies. You have a doctorate in worship studies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So today we're going to be talking about the way that worship is impacted by culture. And before we get into that, there are definitely some things that transcend culture in regards to our worship. So I wanted to ask you, what are some of the elements of worship that need to remain stable despite cultural changes?
Sure. It's a great question. And in fact, it's such a good question that in 1996, the Lutheran Church undertook, they assembled a council in Kenya, Africa, and what came out of it was the Nairobi Statement. And they actually laid down 4 different principles for the relationship between worship and culture. And the very first one is transcultural, that worship should be transcultural. There are certain things that we do in worship that should transcend every other culture. I'll tell you all 4 of them, and then we can kind of maybe talk through them.
Great.
So the first one, like I mentioned, is transcultural. The second one is contextual. So those things that are in a particular time in a particular place.
Mm-hmm.
The third one is countercultural, that worship is sometimes opposed to those things in culture. And then the fourth one is cross-cultural, that we can borrow from other cultures. So to your point on the first one, what are those things that are transcultural, those things that transcend culture? And I think, some of them are really obvious. For instance, preaching transcends culture. It can be found in just about every church everywhere. Singing, baptism, communion, Lord's Supper, prayer. Those are pretty much the ones that we would say you can find these in every culture and every place. They transcend culture. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, though, is that many of those can also be contextual. So while the actual practice of them may transcend culture, the way that they're implemented in different times and in different places may change. Singing may look very different here in the United States than it does in Kenya, Africa, where the document came out of. We're still singing the same way because we're humans producing our voices the same way, but that would definitely take on a particular context in the way it's fleshed out in a ministry in any number of places in the world. So the element is actually transcending culture, but the way it looks may change. And so that would be determined by the context. The third one, which is countercultural, perhaps we don't think of this often, though it is definitely part of our theology, is that our worship as the church definitely stands against many things that our culture would say is okay. And as we assemble as the church, so let's put it in the context of the Bible, right? As early Christians are assembling and declaring that Jesus Christ is Lord, that is standing in stark contrast to Roman pagan ideology, who is declaring that Caesar is God.
Right.
So in that context, you can clearly see that the worship of the church is countercultural. And the same would be true in our context today. The president isn't declaring himself to be God, but there are certainly other ideologies that we are standing against. We're celebrating the right of life, the right of marriage, and so those things in the context of our worship are standing against the culture. And then the last one would be cross-cultural. So how can we embrace the diversity that is clearly present in the world and that should be part of the church as a whole? So what are those elements that we can borrow from other cultures? Probably 2 or 3 years ago in chapel here at the college, we had a girl on our praise team who came from a missionary family and spoke fluent Spanish. And so we introduced singing a song in Spanish, taught it to our student body, and then sang it in Spanish. So in that context, we were doing something that we would say is transcultural, the singing, that normally looks very contextual for us here in the United States. But we then made it cross-cultural because we were taking or borrowing from another culture, and we were doing it authentically and respectfully, and we were allowed to participate with our Spanish brothers and sisters in that way. And it really, I think it broadens the mind and our respect for how diverse the body of Christ is. It's not limited to Jacksonville, Florida. It is everywhere. And being able to borrow those things cross-culturally really expands our horizons in that respect. So in that instance, we were covering a full gamut of what the Lutheran Church was trying to pinpoint for us, and how does the church relate to its culture, and what are those things that we would say these are non-negotiable.
So that list that you provided at the beginning in terms of what those elements are, was that an exhaustive list, or would you say that there are other elements that need to be there that you didn't mention?
No, so those are the 4 that came out of that document. And actually, the Lutheran Church at the time had no understanding that the Nairobi Statement was going to become one of the definitive documents on worship and culture. So, I mean, if you talk to somebody about worship and culture and they've studied this, and they're gonna immediately say, the Nairobi Statement, because they did such a good job of narrowing down what could be an extremely difficult undertaking. And I think they did a great job of saying these are really the 4 ways that worship can relate to its culture. So I don't know that I would presume to add anything to it, because it works. It really helps us think in terms of the elements that we're putting into worship and how those relate to not just our particular time and place, but the church global, which was the point. And the reason that it came out of Africa was because they were church planting, and they were trying to figure out, how do we spread the gospel to different cultures, and how does the gospel look in that culture, and how do we appreciate what is already present in that culture without compromising the gospel and without compromising the culture, because both of those things are extremely important. Obviously, we want to protect the integrity of the gospel, but we also want to protect the integrity of the culture in which the gospel is taking root. And so I think those 4 things really speak very well as to how worship should look in those different places.
Okay, and that's really helpful background. Do you know much about their process in terms of establishing those 4 elements? I mean, certainly they're going to be reading the Bible, but this is a Lutheran statement, right? So they're connected to a church tradition.
Sure.
Could you speak at all to?
So it was an ecumenical group. They purposefully involved different denominations in it. So it was hosted by the Lutheran Church there in Kenya, but it was those 4 elements came out of an ecumenical study where different denominations spoke into it. I don't have an exhaustive knowledge of exactly what the process was, but I do know it wasn't strictly limited to the Lutheran Church, and I think they were broad enough in their categories that it's not locked into any particular church tradition. And interestingly, those things that we would say are transcultural, really they don't just transcend culture, they transcend denomination. You'd be hard pressed to find a Christian denomination, what we would call Christian, that doesn't preach, that doesn't sing, that doesn't baptize, that doesn't practice communion in some way. So those elements pretty much are found across the board. And again, though, the denomination then becomes the context, right? So even though they transcend our denomination, they do look differently in different places. One denomination may use the lectionary and preach out of certain texts, whereas another one may be preaching through a sermon series, and someone else is writing prayers and someone else is praying extemporaneously. So the context, which would be the denomination in that place, in that context, is forming and informing how the worship practice looks. So I think they were very respectful of that and very conscious that they were not creating a document that they wanted to be limited to the Lutheran.
Yeah, and pinpointing the fact that it was African church planting context, I think that for me is very helpful,
Right.
Because that explains not that we don't have different cultures in America, but I think sometimes it's not as easy to see the differences between a culture in, say, Jacksonville and even Orlando, right? Like there are different cultures in these
Sure.
areas, but they're not as cut and dry. Whereas I could imagine in an African context, you've got a ton of countries, and even within those countries, many starkly different cultures.
Right.
And so I think that some of the questions they would have been dealing with would be a lot more clear in that context. That's for me, that's very helpful.
Right.
Okay, so you alluded to the fact that you don't want to go in and just destroy a culture. You don't want to just duplicate your culture onto this. That's a problem missionaries have talked about a lot.
Sure.
But it's also true that some cultures do have, as you've already said, they have elements that are counter-Christian. So how important is cultural sensitivity, and what's the benefit of having culturally sensitive worship?
So I think I don't think that can be as easily answered as the Nairobi statement, where we pinpoint those things, because on some level, I think the countercultural elements, if they're not immediately obvious, meaning they're not immediately immoral, or obviously immoral, then those may take time. A missionary may have to be in a culture for a while before they figure out what are those things that the church really is standing against. And they may not even be aware of those things even within the first few years. So I think it's really hard to say these are the things that we would adapt and these are the things we would never adapt. So outside the bounds of morality, I think that is very specific to the culture where the church is taking root and where it's being planted. And I think that the church tends to grow into those things. As far as how important is it to relate to the culture, I think that is very important. So if we can kind of draw a line or a circle around these things are immoral, we're not talking about those things. So once those are discovered, then we don't bring those into the church. The gray areas are the difficult parts, right? So what are those things that are not immediately obvious, that are immoral, but have some meaning in that culture that those people would find very odd to be in worship? So there's that gray area right there on the outer rim of the circle, and that really is where the missionary has to decide, okay, we can't put this in worship because this has a meaning to these people in this time and place. And it stands against our ability to overcome those things. On the other side of that is those things that are clearly not immoral, that don't have any negative associations with them, that are absolutely necessary. For instance, let me give you a really obvious one. Singing and preaching need to be done in the native language, right?
Yeah, okay.
So in order for those people to authentically enter into worship and to get something from what's happening in this place, it needs to be done in their language. That's something that is culturally relevant to them. So that's an obvious one. That's not a gray area. We would say that is, it's so obvious, it's almost ridiculous.
Right.
And yet, though church history would tell us that hasn't always been true, right? One of the main things that Luther fought against in the Reformation is services being done solely in Latin, because it wasn't relevant to these people. They had lost the meaning of what was happening in their services. They were completely detached from what was happening. So we say it's really obvious, and yet church history would also remind us it's not as obvious
For quite
as
a long
perhaps
time.
we
Yeah.
think it is.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So yes, language is probably the most obvious of those things. That how would you enter into worship if you have no idea what's happening? It doesn't matter what's being said from the pulpit if you don't understand it. Does it matter these words you're singing if you don't understand what you're saying? So language for sure, and of course there are other elements, art, just the style of the music. Again, you get dangerously close to the association part there, which has to be determined again by someone who's in that culture.
Yeah.
But most people would agree that the style of the music needs to conform in some way to what is normal for these people, and not so distant and so abstract that they find it irrelevant, or that they feel some other culture is being imposed upon them. That's a very difficult place to authentically engage with Scripture, with truth, with God, if you feel as though what's happening isn't relevant, or even something that you can participate in. There's some boundary there.
Yeah, I had an experience with that just a couple weeks ago.
Awesome.
I was in, honestly, kind of out in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina, and I was in a very just old church. They've been around for a long time, and for me, at first, I felt like they were kind of like stuck in the past. It's just not the type of context that I typically worship in.
Sure.
But the longer that I was there, I was like, oh, no, this is actually just where these people live, and this is kind of how it is. And I was like, wow, that's so fascinating. Like I kind of felt like I needed to broaden my horizons a little bit, but in a way that I don't typically think of horizons needing to be broadened.
Sure.
So.
And most of us don't, right? Because most of us are where we are, and we're worshiping in that specific time, in that specific place. I think the danger comes when we begin to think that our time and place is the right time and place. And when we begin to think that the way we're doing worship, the way we're engaging with God is the only way, and we think something about this is working, and I'm going to stick it on that model over there. And I think that's where the danger comes, rather than figuring out who these people are. And that looks, like you just said, you don't have to go to a different country to do that. You could drive to South Carolina, right? Yeah. Because, or in April, I was in Queens, New York. My goodness, that church is extremely diverse. And so figuring out what works for those people, it can be really complex. That's where, the church is actually called All Nations Baptist Church. Yeah. So how do you figure out what that culture, and the only way you do that is by being there for a while and learning those people and learning what works for them. Again, not compromising truth, because if you went to Queens, New York, you went to South Carolina, they're probably baptizing, they're doing Lord's Supper, they're singing, just maybe perhaps not in the way that you would hear it often. They're preaching. So those things are absolutely transcending culture, but they're looking very much indigenous to those people in that time and in that place. And probably the really interesting thing is if you went back to South Carolina 10, 15, 20 years from now, and I go back to New York in that same amount of time, those churches will probably look different as well. Yeah. Just the same as it does here. If we went back 10 or 15, things change. Not the gospel. The gospel stays central and truth stays central, but it definitely looks different in that particular context.
So on that note, so our churches are evolving because it sounds like you're saying because our cultures that our churches are in are evolving. How can church leaders and church members how can they make sure that their church is appropriately evolving with culture? And how important is it to, I guess, conform your church to the culture that's around you? Because I've definitely been in churches where they were culturally relevant, maybe in the 1970s, and they're still relevant to the 1970s, right?
Yeah. So I'm gonna speak to a word you used for a second, and I'm gonna clarify it. So you
Okay.
used the word evolving. I dislike the word simply because I feel like it implies that things are getting better,
Okay.
and I don't think culture necessarily is evolving. It's just changing.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't bad in the 1970s. It's not
Yeah. No, that's a
bad
good
now.
point.
And I think we should clarify too what we mean by culture. So I think culture comes with negative connotations sometimes, but the culture as a whole. So how we think and how we operate, and it can include styles and mindsets, but not all of those are moral, not all of those are wrong, and not all of those are right.
Yep.
So it's all encompassing, because I think sometimes when we say culture and we say how much should the church conform to culture, we immediately go to a negative place in our minds, right? And we go, oh, the church is becoming worldly, which is we can go there if you want, but that's a completely different discussion of what the Bible is referencing in worldliness. So I hesitate to use the word evolving because I don't think the culture is getting better or worse. Again, not speaking in terms of morality, let's just take style,
Right.
for instance, as a point. The style in 1970 is different from the style now. We have changed, and that's okay. And probably we'll go back eventually to 1970 as things tend to be cyclical. So I think that's one point that I would want to be careful of saying. It's just different, and that's okay. It's okay for culture to change. How does the church move along with that? This has been debated for years and years and years, and there's two ways that you can kind of go about this. One of them is to look at communities like the Amish, who have decided that they want no part of cultural change, and have in some ways deemed parts of culture to be immoral, that we would say these aren't morality issues. But then in other ways, they have said, we're not going to participate in these cultural changes because of the way that we know they will affect our community. So I used the Amish as a case study in my dissertation, which is why I'm ran to the Amish. And so people tend to look at the Amish and say, oh, they don't drive automobiles because they think that's wrong. No, actually, they don't drive automobiles because they know driving automobiles would mean that they could live outside of the 5-mile radius that they have prescribed for their church communities. And so they drive horse and buggy because it keeps everyone within their church within that tight-knit community. So the driving horse and buggy is fundamental to the Amish thinking because it is the way they preserve their community. Wow. And as each community evaluates how they will accept new technology, it's all evaluated on these ideas. How much does this impact our community, and what will the negative outcome be? And honestly, I think we probably don't do enough of that. We look at every new piece of technology as potentially good, which it can be, but we tend to just adopt everything that's given to us. And we are now seeing some of the negative outcomes of that, right? I mean, I'm raising 3 boys. There are technological restrictions at our house because we're inundated by it. And I recognize that it could very easily run and control our lives. So the Amish have taken an extreme approach to that, and they've said, we still look like we looked in 1650, but it's done for a very specific purpose and a very
there's a principle there that
reason
Christians can pay attention to and
exactly
learn something from.
Yes. Now, I don't think we should all become Amish. That's not what I'm saying, but I do think that we should be careful about what we do accept, and that we don't have to accept everything. And historically, the church has been slow. if you look back at how even through the early parts of the 20th century, the church was very slow to catch up with culture. Culture would do something, and then eventually the church might move there. Even styles of music, the culture was ahead of the church, and the church moves into it. I feel like we're moving at an accelerated rate where I don't know that there is much lag time anymore. And again, I'm not opposed to those things as long as we are asking fundamental questions. And I think the fundamental question that the church has to ask, which seems simplistic, but is true, is why?
Yeah.
Why would we adopt this? And I think the why question always has to come before the how, right? We tend to run to the how very quickly, but we often neglect to ask the why question. So why are we implementing this, whatever it is? And then once we have our why, once we know what the purpose and the intention is, that will determine how we implement it and how we use it and what it looks like.
It seems to me like something that it hasn't been said in this conversation, but it's been said many times.
Sure.
At the same time, is that the whole conversation about culture as it relates to worship really needs to be bathed in wisdom, whether that's in the way that we approach the mission field or incorporating elements into our own worship practices. It's something there's so much discernment that's needed on these things all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two principles that theologians talk about when it comes to negotiating worship and what's allowed and what isn't allowed. And the first is the regulative principle, which says that anything that isn't explicitly prescribed in Scripture is not allowed. So unless it clearly states we do these things in worship, we don't do them. And then there's the normative principle, which says anything that isn't expressly forbidden in Scripture is permissible. And both of those ideas come from two different places, and there's pros and cons to both, right? So there's safety in the regulative principle. There's perhaps false unity in that everyone conforms to kind of the same understanding because it's being regulated. Which would kind of be the sense with the Amish, right? It's so highly regulated that it looks like unity.
Yeah.
Whether or not it really is a matter of spiritual discernment. And then normative, well, that really allows for abuses, because if we're adopting an anything goes mentality, then there might be excesses there that shouldn't be. So there's pros and cons to both of those. There's safety, or perhaps even a false safety in some, and maybe even a false sense of fear in another one. But both require discernment. And I think the interesting part for those that adhere to the regulative principle is that they don't take into account certain things, and that is, even if you prescribe these things that are supposed to be in worship, you're not taking into account the context, right? So even if we say we're limiting prayer, singing of psalms, baptism, Lord's Supper, preaching, those are the 5 things that are prescribed in the New Testament that we're going to stick with. Well, the New Testament doesn't tell us what those 5 things look like. And more than likely, those 5 things looked very Jewish because they were coming out of synagogue worship, and they looked very contextual to those people in those time in those places. So we don't get the how. So even if we say only these 5 things, what do those 5 things look like? Right. And that's where we move from transcultural now to contextual, and we have to take into account that those 5 things, even though they are the 5 prescribed things, they may look very different at different times in different places. And so you have to have wisdom.
When I was in seminary, I actually attended a regulative principles church.
Interesting.
And it was interesting, and I had never attended a church that held to that before.
Okay.
And so I was trying to figure out what it all meant. And, I would tell some people that my church holds to the regular principles, and their thought would be, oh, so you only sing the Psalms with no music. And it's like, well, no.
Right.
We're regulative in a different way.
In a different way. Right. And I don't want to, we're laughing because it is somewhat ironic, but I want to be careful that I don't want to come across as making fun of that. There's a safety in it. And I certainly understand the draw of that thinking, because it does eliminate a lot of the possibilities of going wrong. It does safeguard. And again, I think it comes from a right place and a right heart. It comes from not wanting to impose unnecessary rules and restrictions, but a sense of safety, a sense of, here's how we're going to navigate this, and we're going to navigate it by drawing a very strict line around these things. Again, and that, I know I keep running back to the Amish, but that's their same thing. We look at them and say how odd. They look at it and say how safe.
Right. So and I really appreciate you saying that. It made me, being a part of that church, made me really pay attention to the fact that God does care how he's worshiped. And that's a theme that you see all throughout the Bible, especially, starting with like Cain and Abel, right? You've got a very clear instance of God seeming to care about how he's worshipped and prescribing a lot of things about how he's worshipped all throughout the Bible. So I appreciate you saying that. There are some really important questions there that we got to pay attention
to. That they help to answer.
Yeah.
And that in some ways, while I don't subscribe to it, there is a part of me that just kind of long for that. And I think we all do, right?
Yeah.
We all wish to some extent that the Bible was a little bit more prescriptive for us, because it would eliminate a lot of the difficulties that we have in this discussion and navigate. If Paul would have just written down, you sing this way at this time, all the thinking would be taken out of it. But then I feel like a lot of the beauty, the diversity of the global church would be taken out of it too. And I don't think the purpose of the gospel was to be rooted in first century Corinth or Ephesus. I think the gospel was meant to blossom and to take root in different cultures and different places and different times, and to transform those cultures, to stand in opposition to those things that are clearly wrong, and then to redeem those things that can be redeemed. The world, we'll use that term loosely, the world does not need to have a monopoly on all things, right? We don't have to go, oh, the church used that, or the world used that, so the church can't.
Right.
No, those things are taken by the church, and they are redeemed, they are restored, they are made new. The gospel brings life into all of those areas. So apart from it being absolutely immoral, I think there's freedom in that. And I'm so thankful that Paul, by the Holy Spirit, didn't say this is the way it has to be done and we all have to behave like the church behaved in Rome in the first century. No, it's the same gospel. It is the same person of Jesus Christ, but yet marvelously relevant. And I think perhaps the greatest example of that lends that thinking the most authority is the incarnation itself. That Jesus, who could have known from eternity past to eternity future and could have come as a man in 2024 back to those people and pulled out all of his gadgets, didn't. He chose to operate within that world, in that culture, speak that language, go observe Sabbath, go to synagogue, wear their clothing, participate in their rituals, eat their food. That was who he was at that particular time and in that particular place. And I think that is substantial. And I think it just demonstrates that it's okay to adapt to those things that are part of our culture. And the living gospel was present in that, and he transformed his culture and then taught the disciples how to do the same, and they went out. And that, I think that's the point of the church, is not to condemn everything around it, but rather to stand against those things that it needs to stand against, but then to redeem those things that it should, to literally come alongside God in the process of making things new creation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as Christians, sometimes we get so focused on sin, which obviously sin is a big deal. But God created creation good, right? And there is goodness in the world. And like you said, I mean, we get to mediate the blessings of God to His creation and redeem things.
We are creators.
Yeah.
We were gifted with the ability to create and to make and to use talents and abilities to do those things. And so, I think for all the good that the Reformation did, we did tend to lose some of that as the Reformers tried to get rid of some of those abuses of the Catholic Church. We did, in some ways, lose our connection to the arts. And I think that's unfortunate. And those are the things that can be redeemed, that can be brought back, and that are really very reflective of the culture around us in a good way.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I feel like you've brought us to a point in our conversation, culminating with just the beauty of Jesus Christ and His interaction with culture, that we could talk for hours, but I think we'll go ahead and just leave it there.
Well, thank you so much.
Really appreciate you being here with us today. And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you know other people who are likewise curious-minded, I would encourage you to share it with them, and don't forget to like and subscribe. So until next time, take care.